Hello everyone, we hope you're all well. We're going to be speaking today about something really important that is in the mouths of everyone. It's the skill in demand visa.
Yes, skills and demand visa finally being, well, not just introduced, but implemented, and the government has confirmed that the implementation date will be end of 2024.
That's right. I remember when we were speaking about this first early in the year and last year when they first mentioned it. But yeah, like you said, like it's now when it's finally going to be put live, and let's speak about that.
Yeah, definitely. And just to kind of give you a bit of context as well, there was a recent announcement made by the Director of Skill Migration confirming that the regulations have been finalised for the skills and demand visa. Obviously, just a bit of a disclaimer subject to them being released, but it does appear that skills and demand visa is on track to be released this year. So it would be good for us to talk about what exactly is skills and demand visa, what it is, what we don't know. I think that's important as well. And again, just remembering that we still need to see the regulations, so what we discussed today may or may not change.
And the way this is being organized is through specialist skills and core skills.
Yes, and it's really important to keep in mind that, and I'll put a bit of a disclaimer in there again, we actually don't have the occupation list, and I know that question is probably going to come up, so I may as well go straight into it. We don't know what the occupation list is. There are drafts floating around, but the reality is it hasn't been finalized. So from what we understand, on the specialist list, it's going to be jobs that attract a particular salary that are quite specialized, and the core list will more or less reflect the current TSS list with a couple of additions and potential removal of the occupations. But again, we need to see those lists out first before we make any speculations as to what occupations will be on there.
So now, speaking about the general eligibility, I think there is a very important change, which is
the 1 year requirement.
The 1 year requirement, that's right.
Yes, so just in terms of the eligibility, it will more or less mirror the current TSS framework. So the person will need to have an occupation on the list. It needs to be a skilled occupation that's in demand. But the key change here is that work requirement, which is currently set at 2 years, will be reduced to 1 year. So that will hopefully open up doors to a number of applicants who previously weren't eligible for sponsorship. And that's your key eligibility criteria, and obviously having an approved sponsor as well, or a potential sponsor.
Yeah, that's quite of a big change, because a lot of people, like for example, students that are doing like a 2-year course, if they have been diligent in working their occupation, they will be eligible once they finish their qualification.
Yeah, and well, it's actually a really good point that you've mentioned, because there's no requirement for the experience to be post or pre-qualification.
Exactly, yeah.
There's also no requirement for the work to be full-time. That was actually removed from the policy in July for TSS visas this year, and hopefully that will carry through to skills and demand visas. So it will potentially open up doors, and again, subject to legislation, of someone who is studying a course. If they are working at the required skill level, they should qualify for the new SID visa. And let's talk about permanent residency. I'm sure a lot of people have questions. How does one transition from the new skills and demand visa to permanent residency?
So it's going to remain the same in terms of the person must have been working 2 years on the visa. But the big changes that is going to be benefiting a lot of applicants is that they can work for different employers.
Yeah.
And as long as they accumulate these 2 years, then they will be eligible for permanent residency, which is amazing.
It's huge, and that's referring obviously to the temporary residence transition stream. I suppose where the big problem was, let's say if you've got someone working in an occupation for a year and a half, and the relationship with the employer breaks down that period, whilst it's still skilled employment, you can't count that towards temporary residence transition stream. So unless you direct entry, there's not much of an option. Whereas now, if you work for an employer, say for a year and a half, and then you change that employer, assuming the occupation remains the same and you are sponsored, you can buy in a period. And I think it's going to create both flexibility for the employer, but also the employees. So that's a massive change.
Yeah, that is big. That is huge. So Ross, we spoke about the specialist skills and the core skills, but how about those occupations that are not going to be in those lists?
Yeah, and it's a good question because again, it's speculative, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of employers and also applicants where there will be an unfortunate situation that their occupation won't be on the list. There will be labour agreement stream available under the new skills and demand visas. So the short answer is, if the occupation is not on the two streams that we discussed, it would need to be a labour agreement, whether it's company specific or designated area migration agreement. It will just depend on the eligibility.
Yeah, and that opens, I guess, the conversation about what we still don't know about the skill and demands visa.
Yeah, and it's a good segue. What we don't know, well, we don't know the occupation list, so that's important. We don't have the regulations just yet, and we don't have the implementation date. We know that the regs have been finalised, but there's a couple of tweaks that need to be done. We know that the government did say they will give reasonable notice before the visa is introduced, but it will be at the end of 2024. So we're in November now. Could be tomorrow that we get that that announcement. So there's a couple of things that we still don't know.
Yeah, there are big changes, and yeah, I guess we have to stay tuned to see how everything is going to be developing and work on that.
And exactly. And just before we sort of wrap up, what would be your advice to someone who's looking for sponsorship at the moment, or employees wanting to sponsor someone?
Well, look, just following on what you said, we're in November, and these changes may happen like very, very soon. So I think the advice is to action. If you have any application or a process that has already started, finalize that as soon as possible, because if the changes happen tomorrow, then
Yeah, it's a really good point. And look, the changes may not actually impact the person, but I suppose what's secure about the current process is that we have those regulations and we have the occupations. Whereas with a new process, it may not impact you, but we just don't know.
Yeah.
So if you are an employer that's in a position where you're potentially going through the process, or you're thinking of going through the TSS process, I probably would take advantage of this period.